Welcome to the March Madness breakdown here on Vegas Insider, and the brackets have finally been revealed. The road to Houston begins now. Kevin Rogers with you, and Patrick Everson will join us out in Las Vegas coming up in just a little bit, and at least now we know who everyone is playing. We're still waiting for the odds to drop for all these games, but at least the good news is there are breakdowns, or at least the brackets have been broken down, so that's good news. And before we get Patrick on, we're going to just give you a quick rundown of the matchups in case you either don't know what's going on or you do and you want a little bit more insight. So we appreciate you hopping on here on this Sunday evening to tune in. And the four number one seeds, Alabama in the South, Houston in the Midwest, Purdue in the East, and Kansas in the West. Two of those schools won their conference tournament, that being Purdue earlier today. They held off Penn State. And the Alabama Crimson Tide, who knocked off Texas A&M to win the SEC. Houston did not look good in the American Athletic Conference final against Memphis, but they still got a number one seed. And Kansas ended up losing to Texas in the Big 12 championship last night, but Kansas gets the one, and Texas, they end up a two seed in the Midwest. So let's roll through these really quickly before we get to Patrick, just so you know what the matchups are. And in the South, in Birmingham, so that's a nice little home court advantage for Nate Oates' team. Alabama, the number one, they're taking on the winner of Texas A&M Corpus Christi and Southeast Missouri State, which should be a pretty intriguing matchup in the first four. Southeast Missouri State, they held off Tennessee State in the Ohio Valley Championship. They were actually the first team in, and Texas A&M Corpus Christi, they won the Southland Conference. And looking at what these teams did this year, Texas A&M Corpus Christi 23-10 on the season, and the Red Hawks of Southeast Missouri State, they were 19-16, 21-12 to the over for Southeast Missouri State. So keep an eye out on that. And also Texas A&M Corpus Christi, the Islanders 18-10-1 to the over. So a lot of overs with those teams. And also Texas A&M Corpus Christi, they averaged about 80 points a game, gave up about 73. So we'll see a high number on that game when they hook up in the first four. And obviously Alabama will be majorly favored coming up in the game when they face off later in the week. Now, taking a look at who Alabama, assuming they get through this, who they would face in the second game, it's Maryland taking on West Virginia. And West Virginia, for as much as they, I don't want to say struggled this year, but the Big 12 was extremely competitive. And West Virginia had a very high KenPom ranking when it was all said and done. They only went 19-14, but Bob Huggins' team back in the tournament, they were 21-12 to the over this year. And they face a Maryland team who won their Big Ten opener in the tournament against Minnesota, which is nothing to write home about. But then they end up losing to Indiana in the next round. But the Maryland Terrapins, though, still had a pretty good season. Kevin Willard, the former Seton Hall coach, he took over at Maryland this season, his first year. And the Terrapins, look, they are one of these competitive teams inside of the Big Ten. And they put together a pretty solid season when it was all said and done. But the Terrapins, though, 21-12, a big under team. Out of their 33 games, they hit the under 21 times. So Maryland, a big under team. And when you look at West Virginia, big over team. So you wonder how that style of play is going to turn out when those teams hook up. Now, continuing in the South, San Diego State and Charleston, they meet up. Charleston won 30 games this season, and they came out of the Colonial. The Colonial had a bit of a down year. So that's where, a lot of people want to maybe say, oh, well, this could be a big upset. And at least watching CBS earlier, they think that every 12 and below can pull an upset. And I understand that a lot of the, you don't have any runaway teams this year. That even though Purdue is excellent, Alabama's excellent, Kansas is very good, Houston is a top-notch team, nobody's running away with this thing. So you can see some upsets potentially. But when you look at the Charleston Cougars and what they did this season, first of all, Ken Pomeroy, KenPom.com, He has great breakdowns of these teams, great statistical breakdowns. And the 32 conferences are ranked. The Big 12 is number one. The Colonial, which had a lot of good years, they were 26th this year. They were behind the America East. They were behind the Big South. They were behind the A-Sun. They were behind a lot of these schools. And besides Charleston and Hofstra, who were the top two teams in the Colonial, a little bit of a drop off from there. So don't get fooled by this 31-3 record. Charleston was 73rd in KenPom, and some of the big wins they had, they beat Kent State, who ended up winning the MAC, but also past that, they beat Virginia Tech, who had a down year. The three losses came in North Carolina on the road, and we saw how North Carolina really fizzled out. Hofstra and Drexel. And again, Hofstra was the second best team in the Colonial. So they took care of their business when they had to, but really not a lot of great wins for the Charleston Cougars. And again, don't want to take away from them. It's unfair. But at the same time, let's not be misled necessarily by the record. Now, the Mountain West was number 6 in KenPom this year. And San Diego State ended up winning the Mountain West title. They beat Utah State. And you basically had 4 quality teams. I'm saying 4 teams because they all made the tournament. But San Diego State, Utah State's very good. Boise State, also. Nevada is going to be in a play-in game against Arizona State. But San Diego State, what they ended up doing this year, they were 14th overall. So you look at 14th, and Charleston was much lower. San Diego State lost early on to Arizona. They lost to Arkansas. Those games, I believe, were in Hawaii. And they lost to St. Mary's. Those are really good teams that San Diego State lost to. And then when they got to conference play, New Mexico had a hot start, then fell off. Nevada is in. Boise State is in. And the good wins. The problem with the good wins for San Diego State outside the conference, and I understand the whole like November, December mean nothing right now, but just to kind of let you know, they beat BYU, who's not in the tournament. Stanford's not in the tournament. Ohio State's not in the tournament. So San Diego State, kind of like Charleston, not a lot of great wins, even though San Diego State lost to better teams than Charleston did. But kind of curious to see how that game turns out when those two meet. Again, we're still waiting on lines on these games. Virginia plays Furman, and that is a 4-13 matchup. They're playing in Orlando. Also, San Diego State, Charleston in Orlando. But Virginia, who lost the ACC championship to Duke last night, and they end up tying Miami for the best record in the ACC in conference play at 15-5. And Virginia, we know their history. They've won a championship. They've also lost to a 16 seed in UMBC a few years ago. But Virginia, still excellent defensively. They're going to grind you out. And they face Furman. And the Furman Paladins, who come out of the Southern Conference, the SoCon, 20th ranked conference this year out of 32. Furman was 27-7, 15-3 inside the conference. They were 89th in KenPom. Some of Furman's big losses, they lost to Penn State early on, which now doesn't look that bad because Penn State almost won the Big Ten. North Carolina State as well, but they lost to Old Dominion, High Point, who was 302, Western Carolina in conference play, UNC Greensboro in overtime, the Citadel by 4. So you had a couple questionable losses there by Furman. The Citadel is below 300 in the KenPom, but they ended up winning 2 of the 3 games in the SoCon tournament by 15 against Mercer, by 9 against Chattanooga. And Chattanooga, they ended up beating 3 times this year. Now, Furman, they are number 1 in the country in 2-point percentage at 59%. So we'll see how that matches up with Virginia when those teams meet up coming up in the first round. Now, going next to Creighton and NC State, they play out in Denver, so a little more of a home court advantage for Creighton out of Omaha as opposed to NC State. And NC State, I don't want to say it felt like they were one of the last teams in the dance. They had a good season. Let's start with Creighton, who was 3rd in the Big East this year behind Marquette and Xavier. Big East was a very strong conference when you look at getting 5 teams in the tournament, and one of those was not Villanova, who was down this year. But Creighton, though, 21-12 overall. They had a 6-game, think about this. They had a 6-game losing streak in November/December. One of their top players was out. But look at the teams they lost to. Arizona, Texas, Nebraska, that's a in-state rivalry. That's kind of the worst out of all of them. BYU, Arizona State, Marquette. 4 of those teams are going to the tournament. And then in the Big East, they lost to UConn, Xavier, Providence, Marquette, Villanova, and then they got blown out by Xavier in the Big East semifinals. But still, a lot of good losses for Creighton. They're 13th overall in the Ken Pom, 21-12 for Greg McDermott's team. And when you look at North Carolina State, again, criticism with the ACC this year, number 7, because North Carolina, they were expected to do a lot. They fell off the horse. Wake Forest took a step back. Syracuse was not as good. Florida State won 9 games. Louisville was god-awful with 4 wins. So you had, when you look at it, 5 teams made the ACC, or 5 teams made it from the ACC. Pittsburgh, who had a really good season, they're relegated to that play-in game in the 11, and they play Mississippi State in the Midwest. But when you look at the North Carolina State Wolfpack, they ended up number 55 in the Ken Pom, lost to Kansas early, lost to, in conference, Pitt, Miami, Clemson, Carolina, Virginia, Syracuse, Clemson, Duke, and then Clemson. They lost to Clemson 3 times this year. So the good news for NC State is they don't have to face Clemson. That's the one team they can't beat. But as far as out of conference, they beat Dayton, but really not. Vanderbilt, I guess in retrospect, is a good win, even though Vandy, they missed the tournament. They made a lot of strides this year, but not a lot of great wins outside the conference for North Carolina State. The 3-14 game is Baylor and UCSB, Cal Santa Barbara, the Gauchos. And Baylor, who had a quick exit in the Big 12 tournament. They lost to Iowa State out of the gate, and Baylor 2 years ago won the tournament. But last year, they ended up getting bounced in the second round by North Carolina. They had that big lead, or excuse me, they were down big to North Carolina, came all the way back to tie it, forced overtime, and then lost. So Baylor looking to get back, and they're now a 3 seed. But first for the Baylor Bears. They started off Big 12 play very poorly. And the Big 12 was number 1 this year, top conference. They had Kansas, Texas, Baylor, K-State, Iowa State, West Virginia all got in, and TCU as well. So you had basically an entire league almost, except for the Oklahoma schools and Texas Tech. And Texas Tech was normally in the tournament for a long time. So the Big 12 did very well. But Baylor at 22-10 overall, 11-7 in the Big 12. They started 0-3 in the Big 12. They lost to Iowa State, TCU, and Kansas State out of the gate. But then they went on this big run, and understandably, they beat Oklahoma State, Texas Tech, Oklahoma, West Virginia. There's mixed reviews about them. But they did beat Kansas at home. They had a huge lead at Kansas also, lost that game, lost to Kansas State. They had some bad road losses towards the end. Or at least, for the most part, Texas, KU, K-State lost to all of them. Iowa State humbled them twice. Iowa State was the one team that really had Baylor's number this year. So Baylor, now they get UCSB out of the Big West. And Big West was a middle-of-the-road conference this year. UC Irvine was the favorite. They were 15-5. UCSB actually was also 15-5, but Irvine was the team that was favored to win the Big West tournament. But UCSB ended up winning that. And they won 3 in a row in the Big West to win that tournament. They finished the season with a 7-game winning streak, including the 3 wins inside the conference tournament. But some of the losses for UCSB early on: Northern Arizona, Duquesne, UC Riverside in conference, Cal State Northridge, and then 3 consecutive losses to Irvine, Riverside, and Cal State Fullerton. And then you say, who are the big wins that Santa Barbara had? Fresno State. There really is nothing outside of the conference that looked really good for UCSB. So it'll be interesting to see what Baylor does coming up in that matchup. 7-10 in this South, Mizzou and Utah State and Sacramento. And Missouri, they had actually a pretty good season under Dennis Gates his first year, came from Cleveland State. And Missouri, 11-7 in the SEC. They lost to Alabama in the SEC tournament, but still Missouri had a great year, 51st in Ken Pom. they had that miracle win against Tennessee back last month. And since then, some of the wins are not really great as far as the competition. Ole Miss, LSU, Georgia. They did beat Mississippi State in overtime at home, beat Tennessee at the buzzer. But my problem with Missouri is, in reality, who did you beat? When you run through the non-conference, Southern Indiana, Penn, Lindenwood, SIU Edwardsville, Mississippi Valley State, Coastal Carolina, Houston Christian, they beat Wichita State in overtime, Southeast Missouri State, and Southeast Missouri State's in the tournament as a 16. Kansas humbled them in Columbia. They barely got by UCF. Did have a good win against Illinois. I'll give them that. They beat Illinois soundly at the end of December and beat Kentucky out of the gate in the SEC. But the losses, Arkansas, A&M, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi State, Auburn, Texas A&M, and then lost to Bama again. And inside the conference, beat Arkansas, but they beat Iowa State handily at home. But I'm just not really sold on what Missouri did as far as some of their big-time wins. Now, when you look at Utah State, Mountain West again, was competitive this year. San Jose State was another team that really played well. Utah State 18th in KenPom. So when you look at the seeding here, Missouri's a 7, Utah State's a 10. Curious to see how that line will come out. And Utah State had a couple top 100 wins early on. Bradley, who lost to Drake in the MVC. Santa Clara, who was decent out of the West Coast Conference. Oral Roberts, who was undefeated in the Summit League. Washington State, who was decent in the Pac-12. I mean, not UCLA or Arizona decent, but they were like middle of the pack. And the losses late, losing to San Diego State in the Western or the Mountain West Championship, lost to San Diego State actually 3 times. So a couple of these teams in the tournament lost to their conference rival 3 times. But they lost to San Jose State, lost to Nevada, lost to Boise State. Those are good losses. Like, those are quality losses that they had. So Utah State also coached by Ryan Odom, who was the coach of UMBC when they beat Virginia as a 16 seed back a few years ago. So that we're pretty curious about. One more matchup I want to get to in the South before we get to Patrick Everson, who is in Las Vegas at the Superbook. We'll get to him in just a second. Arizona and Princeton, they're in Sacramento. And Arizona ended up holding off UCLA, a little bit of a banged-up UCLA team in Vegas last night to get the automatic bid. Arizona would have been in regardless. I mean, Arizona and UCLA were both in. It just depends on who got the automatic bid. But Arizona 28-6 overall, 14-6 inside the Pac-12. And that obviously shows you that they took care of their business outside of the conference. Now, Arizona did beat San Diego State and Creighton and Cincinnati and Tennessee and Indiana. They had a lot of really good non-conference wins. And all their losses came inside the conference. They got stunned by Utah early. Utah was a big disappointment. Stanford, they lost too late in the season. Washington State got them in Tucson. But besides that, Oregon, Arizona State on that buzzer-beating shot from 60-something feet away. That one they probably end up winning. UCLA beat them at the end at Pauley. So Arizona, very quality team, and they're facing Princeton out of the Ivy League. Princeton ended up beating Yale today to win the Ivy. The Ivy actually had pretty good numbers this year. Yale and Princeton were the top 2 teams in that conference, and Princeton ended up playing that game in their backyard. That's where it happened to be. And the Ivy League is only a 4-team tournament. It's not 8 teams. It's only 4. So you only had to win 2 games. But Princeton finished 21-8. They were 0-2 to start the season, in fact. Some of the losses, Hofstra, Navy, Delaware, Iona, who was pretty decent with Rick Pitino for them, but they lost to Brown, Yale, Dartmouth, and Yale, and they beat Yale at the end. So Dartmouth, not a great loss, but besides that, Princeton still probably doesn't have a lot of great wins. That's the biggest issue there. So we had to run through the South region there. And let's bring on Patrick Everson, shall we? Patrick, it's good to talk to you. I haven't seen you in a while, but it seems exciting there, right? What's the vibe there out the Superbook in Vegas?
Well, I mean, there's a smattering of people in here today. It's, kind of interested in what's going on with the selection. I don't think they'll see too much activity betting-wise today, but they'll start to, there'll certainly be some of the sharper guys around town. We'll try to see if they can get an early edge, pick off a couple of numbers. And by the way, I apologize. I forgot to bring my studio light. I had everything in my bag, I thought, except my studio light. So it's a little darker in here today, but hopefully it works all right. But look, the bottom line is this place will be packed. Not just everybody thinks, oh, Thursday, Friday, it's going to be a zoo. Wednesday is going to be a zoo, people. And the reason is that people have figured out, thankfully, that they need to be here Wednesday, if not earlier, to get their mobile apps in order. If you don't have the mobile app already, you're going to want to get here before Thursday, and you're going to want to register and fund your mobile app. If you already have a mobile app, but you live out of state, you're going to want to get here before Thursday and get your mobile app funded, because unfortunately here in Nevada, you still can't do remote funding, which sucks. It's a silly policy. The Gaming Control Board needs to fix it. I guarantee you the sports books, generally speaking, are in favor of at least mobile funding at this point. But for the moment, you can't do that. So you need to get here early. You don't want to be tied up on Thursday morning in lines that are going to be a mile long, not just to bet, but to fund and register. You don't want to be caught up in that mess on Thursday. So if you're coming out to Vegas, which there's nothing else quite like it for the first few days of March Madness, you're gonna, if you can, if you've already, if your plans are flexible, or if you already made your plans, hopefully you're getting here like Tuesday, Wednesday. Get all that stuff out of the way. Be ready to just roll with your bets through your mobile app on Thursday.
Now, Patrick, obviously you've been around the block for this for a very long time, and we have a few days until the first day. I know Tuesday you have 2 games, Wednesday you have 2 games, but what's the feel with everyone when they want to get their bets in? I know the numbers are starting to roll in now. We'll get to them in a little bit, but is it? I know you have out-of-towners coming in later in the week, but sure. As far as the locals, do they jump on it tonight, tomorrow? Do they wait till Thursday? What have you heard with what they like or how they like to do it?
Right, and I think generally I don't think there'll be a whole lot even from the locals over the next couple of days. It'll be a flood, just as it is from everybody coming to town. But it's like you and I talk about every week when we were doing the opening odds report, the opening odds live stream on the NFL each week, Kevin. There are certainly going to be some people, savvy people, who are looking at numbers and seeing if there's an opportunity today. Whether it's a buy now or buy later, and I'm sure there's probably already been some movement. I see BetMGM has got several games up already. Still waiting on Superbook to populate on the big board behind me, which is why I keep looking back from time to time. But I'm sure that some of those numbers, all of those numbers, are probably going to be up pretty soon on all of the Thursday, Friday games that are set so far. Obviously, you've got these play-in games that are going to be out there for a little bit, but those numbers will be up as well. It's going to be, there'll certainly be some, like I said, some buy now, buy later, depending on what you're looking at out of these lines, where you feel maybe the public's going to weigh in over these next few days. And therefore, like I said, have the mobile app, get your best price, pregame on Thursday, pregame on Friday. As you're getting closer to tip and the public's betting into a team, you may be able to get a better number. And again, just as you and I talk about every week during the NFL, it's a similar situation that comes up here. But I can tell you, local, people coming from out of town, people going to, people participating now in Ohio, which has just been off to a hugely great start in sports betting. And obviously New Jersey, New York, and, 2.5 dozen states or jurisdictions across the country. It's going to be nuts come Thursday. It's just going to be absolutely crazy. The retail books here in Nevada are going to be jam-packed, especially here in Vegas. There's going to be just bodies everywhere, bets and money flying everywhere. There's really nothing like it. I mean, look, the Super Bowl is awesome, and as a single-day sporting event, nothing takes more money than the Super Bowl in the United States. But the tournament's not a single-day sporting event, and really, they'll probably outdraw Super Bowl in terms of tickets and money over those first 4 days of the tournament, just because there's just the volume of games and the number of people betting into it. It's going to be spectacular.
Patrick, I'm going to reveal some of this now. I'm looking at BetMGM and what they have. A couple of the play-in games. Texas A&M Corpus Christi opened up as a 3.5-point favorite against Southeast Missouri State, which I'm not shocked. I mean, Texas A&M Corpus Christi was the top seed in the Southland and ended up winning that. Southeast Missouri State was a middle-of-the-road team in the Ohio Valley, so not really surprised by that. Texas Southern laying 2.5 against Fairleigh Dickinson. What a lot of people don't know, Patrick, because you don't really have everyone that is totally tuned into this, Fairleigh Dickinson didn't even win their conference. They were the Northeastern Conference I want to say representatives, because Merrimack won the tournament. They were the top team, but they're ineligible because they've only been in the league a few years. So it's kind of a dumb rule. They're not allowed to go. So Fairleigh Dickinson ends up going, and that's why they're in the 16 spot. So they're the only team that really didn't even deserve to get in. So in that case, Texas Southern, who won the SWAC, they are favored in that one, laying 2.5. Now, I want to go over a few more here for some of the other games. And one I just mentioned before you came on, Utah State laying 1.5 against Missouri. That's a 7-10 game. And guess what? Utah State's the 10. So a lot of people, they look at seeding. Oh, Missouri's in the SEC. Utah State's the Mountain West. Missouri should beat them. Utah State is favored to their top 20 KenPom team. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that was one of the ones. I was taking some notes as they were doing the bracket reveal. I've been hanging out all afternoon and through the evening here at the Superbook. And that was one, right away that caught my eye. I was at Utah State-Missouri game. The Mountain West tournament was just held here. Vegas is look, we're getting a regional next week, which is going to be outstanding. And a few years from now, Kevin, we're getting a Final Four. It's going to be off the charts good. But during conference tournament week, there's like 5 conference tournaments that come through Las Vegas, including, of course, the Mountain West, UNLV being the host school for that. So, out here, we're familiar with Utah State. That is a good program. That is a good team. And I definitely that was one of the ones I wrote down. I think that's a really interesting matchup. I've seen some chatter on Twitter and elsewhere in the media and so forth about Missouri over the last couple of weeks. And obviously Missouri makes its way into the tournament as a 7 seed, but that's definitely in the action report article that I'll have going up later tonight at Vegas Insider, which will probably have maybe 14 to 16 of the 32 games that'll be contested on Thursday and Friday. Just kind of picking out what we think are the most intriguing matchups. That one's definitely on there. I think it's really intriguing. And to your point, you got to, there's, 8, 9, 10, 7, 6, 11. There's not a whole lot of difference between those teams. And really not so much here, to the point where, as you noted, Utah State a 10 seed, but seeding and odds making are two very different things, which is something we learn about a lot during the tournament. And, some of the people who are still kind of getting up to speed as sports betting goes nationwide are like, oh, we've got a 10 upset of 7 today. Utah State beat Missouri. Well, it's not an upset if you're looking at the odds necessarily. And I think that's an interesting place to start with that game, with Utah State being the favorite against an SEC squad.
You mentioned, Patrick, about all the tournaments in Vegas, and it was crazy seeing the Mountain West, the WAC. The Pac-12 was there too, and UCLA lost to Arizona last night. Both are very high seeds. And what did you see out of the Pac-12? Anything? Because we have UCLA, Arizona in as 2 of them. Arizona State's got to play in. USC is a 10 seed. What did you see with the Pac-12? Any teams to really, besides the top few, that could make a run? Or do you think UCLA or Arizona may get tripped up early?
Well, I think UCLA, we got to, obviously over the last 2 weeks, or over the last week and a half, they've got a couple of key injuries. Now, fortunately, they still have the Pac-12 Player of the Year, and had and looked pretty good in the tournament. It was interesting in the semis on Friday night. They lost their center Bona on Friday night, and it looked like it might get a little interesting in that game. But UCLA kind of rallied and then just ended up blowing out Oregon ultimately in a game that was relatively close. They lose their center. They were already down Clark, and yet they find a way to just put Oregon away. Arizona, obviously, as we know, last night goes on to win the Pac-12 tournament, wins the final over at T-Mobile Arena, which is where regional action will be next week in the West. So I think there's a little bit of a concern about where UCLA is at injury-wise. So even though normally in a report like I'm going to be doing tonight, I'm trying to focus on games that I think are pretty intriguing, not games that are going to have, 15, 18, 22-point spreads. But I'm going to include UCLA and UNC Asheville in that, not because I think UNC Asheville is necessarily going to win, but just because it's something, the UCLA injury situation is something to keep your eye on over these next few days and just be aware of as you go into this first round. It may become, it may be a non-issue in this first round, but it certainly could become an issue as the Bruins move forward. If they win and then they're in a 2-7 matchup or a 2-11 matchup, depending on how that works out, or a 2-10 matchup, depending on how that works out, could be worth keeping an eye on. Arizona, man, that's a good team. That's a really good team, and they've been kind of near the top of the odds board. So is UCLA, much of the year, although UCLA has slid back just a little bit as odds makers and perhaps bettors kind of assess where UCLA is at injury-wise.
Now, UCLA, assuming they beat UNC Asheville, the 15.5-point favorites at BetMGM,
Right.
They would play the winner of Northwestern Boise State. And Boise State, another one of those Mountain West teams, those grinded out teams that a lot of people out east don't really watch. But Northwestern had one of their best years ever, and they finished, second in the Big Ten, ended up losing early in the Big Ten tournament. But interesting here, Patrick, at BetMGM, Boise State, the 10, they're laying 1.5. They opened 1.5-point favorites against Northwestern, so that tells you a lot too.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm looking at BetMGM's odds right now. I went right to them, so it's coincidental minus 1.5 Boise State in another 10-7 game, and another Mountain West team this time favored against a Big Ten team, and in fact, the team that took second in the regular season in the Big Ten. So, like I said, it's fascinating. Seeds and odds are not necessarily going to line up with some of these kind of middle games. The perhaps even the 5-12s, they won't really be what you might think they would be, even if the 5s are favored. But the 6-11s, the 7-10s, the 8-9s, you may see the lower seeded team as the favorite. And like you said, Boise State grinded out team and had a really good season. Obviously, Northwestern exceeded expectations. I almost wonder, and would certainly love your thoughts, whether Northwestern, which had a better than anticipated regular season, like you said, they went out early in the Big Ten tournament. Almost wonder whether that's a blessing in disguise. It's when you got to trying to go through and win 4 games in 4 days and get yourself worn out, and then you've got to turn around and travel for the tournament. They knew they were in. I don't think they would have improved their seating too much more than what they got. If they'd gotten much further. So maybe it's worth it for them to have another day or two to breathe.
Yeah, and also with Northwestern, Patrick, and what they've done in that Big Ten, where just getting some of the numbers here brought up with the Big Ten, that, look, Purdue was the top team by far. They ended up holding off Penn State, but all the teams that played very well in the Big Ten, Purdue, Indiana's a 4, Northwestern, there are 7, Michigan State's a 7, Maryland, Illinois, Iowa, Penn State they were one of the bottom half teams in the conference, and they had that big run in the Big Ten, which got them pretty far. So I'm curious to see out of the Big Ten who ends up really going where. But I want to go another place with you here, because you brought up too, I know this is one of these 15-point games, but Gonzaga and Grand Canyon, who actually were both in Vegas, because Gonzaga, the WCC, Grand Canyon at the WAC, and Bryce Drew, the former Valpo hero and Valpo coach, is the coach at Grand Canyon, the Antelopes. They end up winning the WAC, and Gonzaga's laying 15.5 in that one. And Gonzaga, everyone thinks they got to get it together as far as going on a Final Four run, that they've had some failures over the years. But could that one be one where people could look at Grand Canyon, or maybe Gonzaga, after we saw what they did to St. Mary's, that they could go on a big run?
I think it might be worth a look. It's a big number, as you would expect in a 3 versus 14 game. I did get a decent look. Didn't go out to the West Coast Conference tournament at the Orleans here, but did keep an eye on it on TV throughout that tournament. Gonzaga looked awfully good. St. Mary's is a really good team, and Gonzaga looked very good against St. Mary's in the championship game of the West Coast Conference tournament. I think that's a team that's rounding in the form. And in fact, a few weeks back, look, they've had a great season. They haven't lost very many games, but they did slide back on the odds board a bit. I think at some spots for the national championship, you might have been able to get them at 30. I took a bite at 25-1. I just feel like 25-1 on a Gonzaga team that's really, really good as a 3 seed. I mean, if you consider a seed a ranking, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's hopefully in the ballpark, then you're saying they're among the top 12 teams in the tournament. I like 25-1 on that side. And but to your point, it's a lot of points for Grand Canyon, first game of the tournament. A lot of times these lower seeded teams, most of the time these lower seeded teams, they're going to come into these first round games just they're ready to go. It's a ball of fire for them. They're potentially their only shining moment in the first round. So I think that could be worth a look to see how things unfold over the next couple of days, see if that line goes out a little bit more, maybe makes it a little bit more interesting if the public weighs in on Gonzaga. just with Gonzaga being a perennial national championship contender, they're going to get some public action as we get toward. I don't know if that's a Thursday, Friday game, but as we get toward that game.
And that game's in Denver, too. And Grand Canyon, a lot of people don't know, is in Phoenix. So
Right.
it really isn't that much of a travel advantage for Gonzaga. That's not that bad for Grand Canyon. Not saying they're going to win the game because it's from Phoenix to Denver. But I want to flip to this one, just kind of comparing it. St. Mary's, Patrick, they're a 5 against VCU, who's a 12. Now, it's the West region, but that game's in Albany, New York. And St. Mary's from California is going to go all the way across the country. VCU in Virginia, they're not going far. And VCU, I'm not going to say a sneaky good team. They're a really good team who we've seen them. They were the Final Four at Shaka Smart years ago. They've gone through different coaches and still go pretty far, or at least have had upsets here and there. They beat Duke a long time ago in the tournament as well. I know it doesn't mean much now, but VCU is a pretty solid program. I feel like this is one that can really be an upset alert. And also St. Mary's laying 5.5 in that game. I think VCU has got the travel. I think VCU is underrated here. I think that's one that people should keep an eye out for.
Oh, I won't disagree with you. I like St. Mary's, notwithstanding the seed and the seed is probably on the mark, but the travel is an interesting spot. I like St. Mary's notwithstanding that, but getting in a position where you got to go all the way across the country. And look, it's a 5-12 game, which you think there's some separation there. And 5.5 isn't a small margin, but it's not that much. It's a couple of buckets. It's a couple of 3-pointers, So I think the odds makers, and again, I haven't seen anything up at the Superbook yet, but I figured I'd take a look back. But obviously the odds makers think this is a pretty reasonable 5-12 matchup. Could be a really good game. Could come down to just a couple of buckets. So, and with VCU not having to travel far, not having to go too far, and St. Mary's having to make the cross-country trek, it's certainly an interesting spot for VCU. And those are some of the things you should take into consideration, beyond seeding, beyond odds. Look at which teams have to travel, have to pull up stakes and make long trips going into this first weekend.
This one, Patrick, is so interesting. Memphis and FAU. That's the 8-9 in the East. That's opposite Purdue. Again, we always have to do a disclaimer, Patrick, assuming they get past the first round, but we're going to assume Purdue's getting past the first round. But FAU, who rolled through Conference USA this year, first time they've won the Conference USA title. It's funny, they're going to leave Conference USA to go to the American next year. And Memphis, they're going to end up playing Memphis in the American. Penny Hardaway's team, they lost the regular season finale against Houston on that buzzer-beating shot. But then they ended up coming back. They beat UCF. They destroyed Tulane. And then they handled Houston today to win the American. And, again, they would have been in regardless if they would have won or lost. They probably should improve their seed. But Memphis in this game, Patrick, laying 2.5 against FAU at BetMGM. I find this one extremely interesting. Also, we're still got to dig into the numbers, but it almost feels like a coin flip type game because FAU, who won their conference, the regular season and the tournament, that they're short underdogs here.
Yeah, right. It sounded like you inferred, if I caught you a little bit there, and I apologize. It's still pretty noisy at the Superbook as always. They got games going nonstop here in hockey and NBA right now, while we're reveling in the March Madness situation. But it sounds like you thought Memphis might have been a little bit underseeded, and I kind of think so too. I think that's a tricky spot to put Memphis in an 8-9 roll against a good Florida Atlantic team in that first round. And like you said, it's really 2.5. It's a coin toss game. The higher seed, if there really is a higher seed, really, obviously the number is higher, but the number is better in an 8-9 game. But a coin toss game against a pretty good FAU team. I would guess Memphis was hoping to get a little bit more of a reward after beating Houston in the AAC championship game today.
Now, moving on to another one. This one is another intriguing game. This is in the East, Kentucky and Providence. And Kentucky opens as a 3.5-point favorite. Two teams, Patrick, that had and again, everyone's got their opinion about the conference tournaments, about how valuable they are or not valuable they are. But Kentucky lost to Vanderbilt in their only game in the SEC. Providence, they put up a stinker against UConn in the Big East. So these teams, in a sense, kind of fresh because they only played one game each, but also not a great way to end the year. Kentucky had their ups and downs. They lost to South Carolina at home. They lost to Georgia on the road, but also had some good wins, beat Tennessee a few times. And Providence, they had a really good start to the season, and then it felt like it sort of fizzled out towards the end, and the Big East was very competitive. Providence was the fifth best team in that conference, but they had a really good start. And then at the end, they lost 4 of their final 5. The only one came against Georgetown, who's got awful. So you wonder here with these two teams, you kind of hit the reset button on it. But also Kentucky played well in Providence, kind of trending backwards.
Right. And yeah, Kentucky really had a decent end to the regular season, notwithstanding to the regular season. Obviously, the conference tournament, not so much. But like you said, they do get a little more rest. They got Shiveway. That's a really good team. It can be a really good team. And like you said, Providence started out well, and both teams get a chance to kind of hit the reset button here. I think that's potentially a bit of a tricky game for Kentucky. Going through BetMGM odds on this, doesn't look like they've posted that game yet. They're slowly but surely rolling these out. Looks like they've probably got about half of the first round games on the board at this point. But it's I think that could be one that's definitely going to be one that's in my report that comes out later tonight, where hopefully we get some insights. Well, we will be getting some insights from some folks behind the counter here at the Superbook on a bunch of these first round games, and I think that's going to be in the mix because I do think that's kind of fascinating or an intriguing, at least I should say, first round game.
Now, another one in that East region, Patrick, is a 7-10 is Michigan State and USC. It feels like a good Rose Bowl game with these two going at it. But Michigan State, who, again, up and down season, they rallied around the tragedy in East Lansing late with a couple of good wins. They had that crazy loss to Iowa where they were up 10 in the final minute, and Iowa came back and tied it and won it in overtime. And then Michigan State had a quick exit in the Big Ten tournament against Ohio State, who had a terrible year, but Ohio State went on a nice run. Now they face a USC team, Patrick, who, again, in that Pac-12, which was very top-heavy, and seeing what UCLA and Arizona did, USC, if a lot of people, they don't forget last year, 26-8, they lost to Miami in the opening round, and there were some really high hopes for the Trojans. And this year, look, they lost to Tennessee and Wisconsin early on. They lost to Andy Enfield's old team, Florida Gulf Coast, in the opener. But besides that, Oregon State's a bad loss, but also losing to Arizona twice, Washington State. Like, they didn't have a lot of terrible losses really in the Pac-12. Just looking for the good wins. They did beat UCLA handily at home. But you wonder if this is kind of a redemption tour for USC and also for Michigan State, how much emotion, how much they have left after going through a really taxing season.
Yeah, no question. A taxing season and, a 7 seed, which is not where Michigan State tends to be. I mean, in kind of the same vein as Duke. I think what did Duke come out with, a 5 seed and a couple of others that come out, even Kentucky for that matter. Some of the blue bloods and some of the teams that you generally expect to be contenders, making deep runs in the tournament, are going to have a little bit more of a challenge early on in the tournament, and Michigan State is one of those teams. Again, another 7-10 game. Looking at BetMGM, I don't think BetMGM has posted those odds up yet. And again, still waiting for the odds behind me to crop up on the Superbook. Those guys they're all back there behind the counter, in the risk room behind the counter here, chopping away. I'm guessing they're just looking to dump them all at once, which is why none of them have come up yet. But they're supposed to be texting me as soon as we get anything. But another 10 versus 7 game where, perhaps the 10 seed is favored here. But look, the Big Ten was decent this year, and Michigan State maybe gets a chance to recharge over these next couple of days too, kind of like we were talking about with Kentucky and Providence. Didn't make a deep run in the Big Ten tournament, so maybe Tom Izzo has his troops ready to go. It's again, those are a lot of these mid-range matchups, these 7-10s, these 6-11s, 5-12s. I think even some of the 4-13s could be really intriguing games come Thursday and Friday.
So USC lost to Miami last year, and the Hurricanes will go to the Midwest. They're going to Albany to face Drake. And Drake out of the Missouri Valley, they're a veteran team. I mean, when I say veteran, they guys are 23, 24 years old, So it's, they're a team that's very, age heavy on that, lack of a better term for Drake. But I saw that Miami, Patrick, they are laying 3.5 against Drake. Miami, who was the top seed in the ACC tournament, and Drake, who won the Missouri Valley, who's had a couple good years. That's kind of interesting. Not really any kind of home court advantage or disadvantage because the Hurricanes staying on the East Coast and Drake going from Des Moines. But what do you think about that with an ACC team taking on a Missouri Valley team in that first game?
Yeah, that was one that I noted as soon as they mentioned it. There's been a fair amount of chatter about Drake, and like you said, Miami regular season champion in the ACC, laying a 3-pointer and the hook against Drake. I think odds makers are on this game. They feel like Drake is legit and is going to give and can give Miami a challenge in this game. It'll be interesting to see how this line evolves over the next few days. Before we get to Friday, I think this is if I'm looking at it right, this is one of the Friday matchups. But this could be a really interesting game on Friday and maybe more of a challenge than Miami expected as the regular season ACC champ to have to face in the first round of the NCAA tournament.
The next one I want to go to with you, Patrick, we're kind of jumping around here, but
Sure.
We saw how Penn State played very well the last few days and almost shocked Purdue today, and they get Texas A&M. It's a really good football game, with these two meeting up. They're in Des Moines in the 7-10 in the Midwest, and Texas A&M had a fantastic season. And look, losing to Alabama the way they did, there's no shame in that. Alabama is the number 1 seed, so Buzz Williams' team had a very good year. Penn State, you wonder with them that not is the momentum going to run out sooner or later. Penn State has gone through this stretch where they've won so many of these close games and played their way into the tournament by winning 7 or 8 games in the last few weeks against really good teams to get in, and they deserve to be in. But will that end up, coming back to bite them now that they have a bit of a reset? And seeing where this line is, just to give you the number off of BetMGM, Texas A&M laying 2.5. So that does tell you a lot that Texas A&M had a great season in the SEC. Penn State was in the bottom half in conference play, but yet the way that Penn State has played, now all of a sudden A&M a 7 seed laying 2.5 to Penn State.
Right. I think Penn State is really interesting, and honestly, before the Big Ten tournament, I was bouncing around some thoughts off a sharp college basketball player who or better, I should say, not player, better. Don't want to give the wrong impression here. Players are not betting on these games, but a pretty savvy college basketball bettor who I talk to each year around this time. And we were just talking strictly about the Big Ten tournament. And he said, you know what? I'd watch out for Penn State was the third, I believe, they were pretty low seeded in the Big Ten tournament. I'm trying to remember. They were a double-digit seed. What's 10. That? 10, yeah, yes.
10.
Okay, I couldn't remember whether it was, I knew it was double digits. I couldn't remember the number, but it's 10. And he said, look, if you're looking for a flyer in the Big Ten tournament, take a look at Penn State. I think that's a team that has a really good chance to make a deep run of the tournament in the Big Ten tournament and kind of shore up its resume for the NCAA tournament. And that is, in fact, what Penn State did. And it looked like they were going to get, run out in the final today, which I don't think would have affected their seeding too much either way, whether they got run out or whether, as they ultimately did, I think they lost by 2 or whatever it was. But they made a really nice comeback there at the end, put Purdue under a lot of pressure. Purdue obviously contributed by making, some not smart plays and not being prepared for the press at the end when they had a big lead. But that's a decent team, Penn State is. And I think Texas A&M, if I recall correctly, Texas A&M, well, first off, they made it to the SEC championship game, correct?
Yep.
And you make it to the SEC championship game, and you get a 7 seed, and you got to face a Penn State team that seems to be kind of putting it together late in the season. That's again another tough spot. I don't know if that game. Have you seen? Is that game up yet? I'm kind of scrolling through BetMGM's numbers right now, and
yeah, BetMGM has a 2.5.
There it is. Yeah, 2. That's right. You said 2.5 exactly. Texas A&M a 2.5 point favorite. It's a coin toss game, and I think Texas A&M maybe thought it would get a little bit better seeding and maybe a little bit more favorable matchup in the first round. But I think Penn State could, although Penn State's now they've had to play 4 games in 4 days. and now have to ramp up for an NCAA tournament game. That it looks like that is going to be a Thursday matchup, correct? So 4 games in 4 days, and now they got to come back and play again on the opening, on the first day of first round play in March Madness.
Yeah, just a quick thing on Penn State and what they've done. I mean, they lost 4 in a row to start February, so you kind of thought they were dead in the water. But then they beat Illinois, Minnesota, Ohio State. They blew that game to Rutgers. Rutgers was down big in that one. They beat Northwestern overtime, beat Maryland by 1. Big Ten tournament, they staved off Illinois. They beat Northwestern overtime. They beat Indiana by 4, lost by 2 to Purdue. And I just really wonder if you run out of gas. That is really the big concern, that Penn State can't beat Texas A&M, but if you just I almost feel like, Patrick, that Texas A&M getting blown up by Alabama, you say, okay, fine, whatever. We're in. Bama's great. We move on. And they just played Alabama last week and beat them at home, so that's fine. But Penn State, the ups and downs they've had this season, you kind of wonder, okay, do we have enough in the tank to move on? Now, I want to go to the East, and Duke, they won the ACC tournament. I guess they don't need Coach K, do they? They have John Shire. They're fine. And they play Oral Roberts, who was the only team in the country that did not lose a conference game this year. They went undefeated in the Summit League. They score a ton. And obviously very interesting here. The game's in Orlando. You would have thought Duke would have got a Greensboro draw, but obviously not. They play in Orlando, which is still obviously closer than what Oral Roberts has to travel, going from Tulsa to Central Florida. But Duke here, just to get the opening number on them at BetMGM, let's see. Duke is laying 7.5 to Oral Roberts. That's the opener. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, and a 5-12 matchup in that one, right?
Yep.
So, in the 5-12s, everybody always looks to these. They're like a magnet for people looking for first-round upsets. The 12-5 is the kind of the traditional spot. How many 12s are going to be to 5 this year? I feel like in this case, Oral Roberts has had a really good season. It's obviously expected to be a reasonably competitive game based on the opening number with the odds makers. As you said, 5.5 at BetMGM at the moment. I assume it's around there elsewhere with some other spots that have gone up. Still waiting on the big board behind me to populate here at the Superbook and hopefully soon. But I'm not sure why. I don't have a whole lot to base it on necessarily, but I feel like, Duke is not in a bad spot here. You get a 5. If you can get through the first round, you're playing a 4 in the second round. That's not a bad place to be necessarily. I think Duke is going to be up to the task here. I got a feeling. It's been kind of a strange year for Blue Bloods. Obviously, Carolina's not even in the tournament. Doesn't deserve to be either. But we talked about how Michigan State had been a little down. Kentucky really wasn't doing that well until a nice late regular season stretch. Kind of got its act together. Duke was in that. You could have had Duke. I'm not sure what their national championship odds are right now, but they had fallen back into the 50-1 range. At one point at some books, maybe more at others. But, when do you ever see Duke at 50-1 to win the national championship? So, obviously, I'm sure that number's adjusted quite a bit, more recently. And, in fact, we can check at LL right now. Not up at March, on BetMGM and some of the other sites I'm looking at right now. But, they'd fallen back as far as 50-1. So, obviously, they were seen as having a little bit of issues as well. But I might like them in this spot. I feel like they're going to, a 5 seed for Duke. It's not something they're necessarily accustomed to, but, I think they'll be ready for this one.
What about future odds, Patrick? A lot of people, what's the thought with the Houstons, the Alabamas, the UCLAs, teams like that people want to say, all right, I want to ride them, or Duke or some of these other teams that could be in that 30, 40, 50 to 1. I'm not talking about Texas Southern. I'm talking about teams that have that shot, that are pretty good, that aren't the favorites. Are people looking to ride those teams? Because obviously Duke and Kentucky, big public names, are not at the top of the leaderboard this year. They're kind of more, I'm not saying the middle, but more of like second tier. That are people trying to maybe jump on those teams to make a run, thinking, okay, now maybe this is the time where you're getting them at a price you wouldn't normally get them at.
Yeah, I think some people are, and hopefully they already have. Hopefully you looked at some of these teams before the big spotlight of March Madness is on them. I got on Gonzaga, as I alluded to earlier, at 25-1. I've got Marquette at 100-1. So I'm fairly pleased with that ticket right now. Now, look, do they win the championship? I don't know. Do they put me in an advantageous position potentially later in the tournament? Possibly. So I'm certainly hoping so. And same with Gonzaga. And I've got a couple of other tickets out there, Indiana 50-1 and so on. So hopefully you saw an opportunity even before we get to this point where the March Madness magnifying glass is on them. But that said, to your point, there are still opportunities here as you look at the bracket now. I mean, just by the volume of teams, you can't have not everybody can be 8-1, 10-1, 12-1, 16-1. You've got to fill this out a little bit. So I do think there's going to be some value to be had on some of these teams. And, basically the biggest reason that Houston is a problem at multiple sportsbooks, including Caesars, DraftKings, BetMGM, and I believe Barstool. Mattress Max all over them. So he's got like 4 bets of, I think he's got 2 for $1 million and a couple of more for half a million that where he got Houston at like 8-1, 9-1, 10-1, higher than what they are now, longer odds than what they are now, obviously. But, so they're all, the books, those particular books are in trouble to Houston to the tune of potentially between the 4 of them, like, I don't know, $25 million or so. But again, that's a Mattress Mac phenomenon. That doesn't necessarily apply to the books where Mattress Mac hasn't bet. And it doesn't necessarily, and doesn't apply to a lot of these other teams. I was going back and forth with Jason Scott. We've been talking about BetMGM a good bit in this past hour because they've got their numbers up still. Waiting on the Superbook here, hoping those are coming. I'm sure some other books have already populated numbers as well. But Jason Scott, he told me a little bit earlier today, Houston is our big loser. As BetMGM is one of the books that took a big play on Houston. I believe it was $500,000 at 9-1 or maybe 10-1. So you're talking $5 million there potentially. He said Kansas also no good, but I will say you could get, a few weeks back, you could get Kansas at a much better number than you could get Kansas at now. But he noted some teams that really have a legitimate chance and that you might want to take a look at. UConn is one that is good for BetMGM, and I think UConn is a team that's worth a look. A couple of other teams that BetMGM would like to see win outside of Houston and Kansas, teams that Jason feels like can win this tournament. Alabama, obviously, they're at a pretty short number. They'd like to see them go. People haven't really been jumping on Alabama. And in fact, I've had a couple of odds makers tell me that obviously Alabama's got some off-court issues, Kevin, and people have been kind of fading them lately, or at least backing off of them, maybe not playing the other side, but just not as keen to bet on Alabama, maybe thinking these off-court distractions become even more so as we get the spotlight of the NCAA tournament. And Jason, again, he said UConn is good for the book. Purdue is good for the book, and Purdue is a very good basketball team, no question, been near the top of the odds board all year. And Gonzaga, who we talked about a little bit earlier, and you're getting Gonzaga at a price that you perhaps haven't seen maybe not right now, but there's probably still at a price you haven't seen in quite a while for a Gonzaga team going into March Madness. I don't know, maybe Duke's worth a shot as well. I don't know.
I'm not going to ask you this, Patrick, about who is that St. Peter's team this year after we saw what they did. Kind of a 1 in a million run, going as a 15 seed last year, making it to the Elite Eight. That I almost feel like people are throwing away money with some of those picks because you still got to win 6 games. That I know you can head back and, once you get through a few rounds, you can do that. But at the same time, this tournament is so hard because you have to win 6 times. And once you're getting past the first 2 or 3 games, not to disrespect the first opponents, you're getting some really good opponents at the end.
Right.
So, it's almost like that Vegas Golden Knights thing a few years ago when they were an expansion team.
Yes.
Everyone jumped on them. And in the end, they still lost to Washington. So it didn't matter. You had nothing to show for it. Are people going to do that and look at St. Peter's and, you look at Florida Gulf Coast and VCU and these other teams over the years that went on runs to say, all right, I want to take them. But again, you get to 3 or 4 games in, I hope you hedge back because you're probably not going to win the championship.
Right. Hopefully you get an opportunity to do that. You can't honestly think it's going to happen. And Jason Scott, while not mentioning any of the teams at BetMGM, he said, look, we've got some long shots, 300-1 and such, that are going to be, that would be trouble. But these teams are not going to your point, it's so difficult to make a 6-team run. And by the time you get to the third round, you're playing really good teams every night. It's pretty unlikely to happen. Obviously, it didn't. St. Peter's was a nice story last year, and some people rode some money line to some wins, and I was certainly among them. And, at one point I got in on a couple of these. Goodness, my battery is going nuts. So I'm trying to check my battery saver here. I hope I don't lose you here, Kevin, because I apologize. I didn't expect this. It should have been on battery saver, and it's not. Still, even in the end, St. Peter's didn't get there, and normally those big long shots don't tend to get there. So.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, it's good timing, Patrick, because we've been on for nearly an hour, so we'll wrap it up and save your battery for the good stuff that you're going to release later on overnight at Vegas Insider. And look, you literally are in the calm before the storm, and it's like the last time when we talked before the Super Bowl, after the championship games, that, all right, now people are just kind of settling. This is a tough one, too. I'll leave you with this one, Patrick, that everyone's going to get their handicapping done. There's only so much you can do. It's one thing to say in the NFL, all right, I know there's 4 matchups going to the Super Bowl. I could jump on it. Where this one, you don't know who's playing each other until an hour before. So you have to throw them all together and look at okay, now how am I going to handle this? But it should be pretty curious to see how everyone approaches this going through the next few days.
No, I agree. It's going to be an interesting tournament. I do think it's a little, it's wide open-ish. I don't think, like you said, we're not going to see a 200. We're not going to see a St. Peter's win the championship game, but it's a little more open this year than perhaps it has been in previous years. Memphis took care of Houston today. That was interesting. Alabama's got some potential off-court distractions. Other teams are not the caliber where they normally are used to being at this time of year. So it's going to be an interesting tournament. The first 4 days will certainly be a lot of fun, and we'll see how it all unfolds. But I anticipate it'll be, as good a tournament as we've seen. I hope it is wide open and we get some surprises into the Sweet 16 and maybe to the Elite Eights and beyond.
Patrick Everson, you can find him on Twitter at @PatrickE_Vegas. He does great work. He's on the ground. He's got the helmet on. He's got everything. Looking for all the angles and talking to the important people out in Las Vegas. And he's live at the Westgate Superbook. And Patrick, as always, we appreciate the time. And let everybody know what they can find from you coming up over the next few days for the tournament.
Okay, so later this evening, and again, hopefully I don't drop off here. My battery's being crazy. But hopefully late this evening, a first-round action report. It won't have all 32 games, just too many games, but we're gonna pick out a lot of the ones that you and I just talked about. Some of the opening odds, maybe some of the early movement, how the odds are going, kind of what went into making all this sausage behind the counter for some of these key games that are in the first 2 rounds. We'll have some video content going with that as well. We'll probably do a piece on Tuesday morning that updates throughout the day, Tuesday, and again on Wednesday for those first 4 for the play-in games. We'll have some action reports on that. And again, as much video content as we can do. And over the course of the first 2 days of the tournament, first 4 days of the tournament, I'll be out in places like here, the Superbook, and up and down the big books along Las Vegas Boulevard and downtown with some plausibly live video reports, if you will, on how some of these first-round matchups are being bet and what the vibe is like here in Las Vegas, which, again, there's nothing like it. If you've never done it, you got a bucket list the first weekend of the NCAA tournament. But I'll be joined. Kevin, obviously, you're going to have a ton of great content this week. I encourage you guys, everybody, to check out everything that Kevin's doing, that Michael Crossan's doing, that Ian McBeth is doing. Joe obviously is going to have a lot of content up in his podcast every day. So really up and down the dial with Vegas Insider contributors. We're going to have a lot of great stuff up on the website, out on social media, on the YouTube channel. Please check it all out.
Patrick Everson, perfect timing there, because it looks like his battery died right at the end, but you know what? It worked out. But check out Patrick's work at Vegas Insider, and he'll have a lot of great information for you. Also coming up this week, keep an eye out for this. I will have best bet videos for Tuesday's play-in games, for Wednesday's play-in games, and then for the action Thursday and Friday. So keep an eye out for that YouTube channel for Vegas Insider TV, and we will have that. And as Patrick mentioned, Joe Osborne chasing that paper tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern. He will have a breakdown as well, and I'll be joining Joe this week on chasing that paper to give out some picks and some more thoughts on the tournament. So we are looking forward to that. It's a very, very busy week, but also at the same time, it is a very, very fun week with the tournament, and usually the first 4 days are always the best. Not to take away from the Final Four, but usually the first few days always fun. Could have some upsets, and see who the Cinderella is this year. So my thanks to Patrick Everson for joining us. I am Kevin Rogers. Thank you so much for tuning in, and keep an eye out for those best bet videos on our YouTube channel at Vegas Insider TV. And also check out VegasInsider.com for the latest lines and also the previews as we go through the night and into Monday. So it's the first place you need to check out if you want to see all the matchups, all the lines, and all the analysis. Again, I am Kevin Rogers. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, best of luck with your bet.